done. Those were the words of the Chancellor as she set out the spending review in the House of Commons today. Rachel Reeves announced day-to-day spending on public services would increase, as would investment in major projects. So how will these changes affect the economy? Well, joining me is Harry Quilter-Pinner, Executive Director of the IPPR think tank. Harry, thanks for joining us. What's your first reaction, do you think? Is this a realistic review?
My pleasure. Delighted to be here. I think I really don't envy the Chancellor the choices she's had to make to get to this spending review. Despite raising taxes at the budget and changing the fiscal rules to create more space to invest, there were some really hard choices. And that is because both the spending plans of the previous government were so tight that she's having to raise taxes just to get back to zero, just to make sure she doesn't have really deep cuts across the board. And it's also because the pressures on the state are growing. So whether that's defence because of Russia and Ukraine, or whether it's because of rising demand in things like the NHS, it means that those budgets are growing really rapidly, and that means it puts pressure on other departments where she's had to give a much tighter budget. So I think there were some really good measures in today's announcements. Lots more investment into transport and infrastructure, which will help drive growth. More money for the NHS. But there are definitely challenges in the future that she's going to face, not least if growth doesn't pick up. She will find she has less tax revenue than she thought, and that will mean either having to make cuts in the future or having to go back and find more taxation in order to plug the gaps.
Well, Harry, you mentioned the NHS. Funding's going to go up by 3%. Is that enough?
So 3%, I mean, it's a lot more than other departments are getting. So the NHS overall, I think, has got a good deal compared to other departments. But as I say, the pressures on the NHS are growing significantly. And that will mean that the settlement is not enough to transform the NHS unless they deliver fundamental reform to the system. And in the coming months, we're expecting the NHS long-term plan, the big reform plan that the Health Secretary Wes Streeting has been working on, to be published. And so I can't really answer that question until we see those plans, because that will determine how much bang we get for each extra buck that they're putting into the NHS. How well are they going to spend that money to deliver better outcomes for patients? And that will be what determines whether that 3% is just enough to keep the NHS on its feet, or whether it's enough to ensure it's fit for the future.
And what about other public services, Harry? Are they, by definition, going to be missing out?
Well, I think there are some areas which are definitely going to get more money. So the schools budget is going up per pupil. So spending per pupil will go up, which is good news. There is increases forecast for local government, which has had a very tough decade. So there are areas that I think we're seeing quite good settlement. There are things that are still going to be challenging. So we are waiting for the Casey review into social care. There was not a huge chunk of extra money into social care allocated so far, and that will put pressure on the NHS. And there are areas such as adult skills or universities where I think the government is yet to set out really compelling plans for reforming those public services, funding them properly. And so there are these big questions that I think the government will have to answer in the coming years if we are to really tackle some of the barriers to growth and to higher wages and opportunity for people across the country.
Now, Harry, obviously all this stuff's got to be paid for, hasn't it, at some point? How are these changes going to affect the ordinary taxpayer?
So, I mean, most of the measures to fund the spending that the Chancellor announced today have been taken. That was what she did at the budget right at the start of this Parliament, when she raised taxes. If you remember the NI, the National Insurance increase, for example, which was controversial at the time, that's what's enabling her to make these generous settlements for things like the NHS now. And similarly, the change in her fiscal rules, if you remember, that creates space for the infrastructure investment that she's talked about in, for example, transport in the north. So at the moment, she has fully funded the pledges that she's made today. The question is, coming up to the budget in the autumn, if if growth is less than forecast, that will mean less tax revenue through the door in the Treasury, and she'll have to fill that gap somehow. Or if, for example, there are extra pressures on public services or on, for example, the defense spend, if there's an exacerbation in Ukraine, that means we need to increase defense spending faster than planned, that will mean that she needs to find more money. So at the moment, she's covered her spending plans, but we need to look out for what changes in the world and what does that mean for her spending plans at the budget in the autumn. And there'll be questions about whether she needs to raise more revenue then.
OK, fascinating stuff. Harry Quilter-Pinner from the IPPR. Thank you.
Thank you very much.